Good morning. Glad you're all here. As you're settling in, we'll transition with the blessing over study, and then we'll get into this morning's text. The blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'tznotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, God, who has encouraged us, instructs us to engage with texts of meaning. So this morning, our story from Genesis is from chapter 11. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. This story follows that of the flood and is typically understood as a response to the flood, or what the flood represents, and we'll talk about that. This story appears in the middle of a series of genealogies. Following the receding of the waters after the flood, Noah and his family begin to repopulate the earth, and we have a long series of genealogies that allows us to trace the line of Noah from post-flood to repopulating the earth, and then we come to this community that's going to be known as Babel with regard to their efforts to do that. What I want to introduce today, or to remind us about, is much like when we were studying the parables and we were encouraged not to rush to domesticate them, or not to rush to come up with what the conventional or shared understanding of that text means, but rather to be a little bit more playful, a little bit looser with regard to needing to imagine that the story comes to teach one particular lesson, but is instead an opportunity to see ourselves or our own experience reflected in that of the generation of the Tower of Babel. Right? So that's important. We're not driving today to make sure that you come away with the understanding of why this took place or what this story means or who you would be in the drama or how this plays out, but rather to be a little bit more expansive, to play it a little bit more playfully so that we can find what meaning speaks to us in our generation today. Is that fair?
You all know the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis. The Jesus figure is portrayed as a lion, and one of the great lines in there, Aslan, the lion, is not a tame lion. It's not to be domesticated God. Think of these stories in that way. Let it be wild rather than contained, and here's what it means, 1-to-1 ratio. Let it be a wild story that reveals a world that we're being invited into. Should we read it?
Yes, let's read the story. Now the whole earth had one language and the same... I'm sorry. Oh, please. Oh, good. Thank you. All the better.
Okay, Genesis 11, verses 1 to 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad among the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So let me reintroduce the way in which, if we were treating this as a Jewish Torah study class, which in a sense it is, how would we begin to read this? We would be looking for something in this story or in a given verse. The Hebrew word is darsheni, which means explain me or explicate me, or what does this mean to you, the idea. So for instance, we might look at where the story appears. It comes after the flood, and draw some inferences or some conclusions there. But let's look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fourth, at the end of the fourth line. The verses aren't numbered here. Then they said, "Come, let us." And the classic rabbinic way of reading this would note that in this particular verse, there are three things they set out to do. What are the three things in that verse? Starting at the end of line 4 and line 5 and 6, what is it they set out to do? Build a city, a tower in the midst of the city, and make a name for themselves. And the classic rabbinic way of reading would say, well, those are obviously three different things. We might collapse them, we might understand that they build on each other, or each one is synonymous with the next, such that you see a picture of the Cathedral of Learning, and it represents Pittsburgh, right? The monument, as it were, or the tower, and the city are synonymous, and insofar as you helped raise the money for it, or you contributed to it, or you participate in one of the international rooms, and you make a name for yourself in that way, right? And so the question becomes, are these good virtues or bad? Is it good to build a city such as it represents? Is it good to build a tower? This tower seems to be unique in its qualities, or what brought it about. And then what does it mean to make for oneself a name? Or what does it mean to understand that you're going to make for yourself a name in this way, by building something physical, or by identifying with an act of effort, or a communal enterprise, such that on the cornerstone of a building it may say who was involved in erecting this building, or at the airport, who the mayor was, and the contractor, and the head of Allegheny County, and right, we're going to list that kind of information. In that way, perhaps you're going to live beyond yourself. You'll make a name. And that's one of the cautionary tales in this story, because we read the story, or at least I'm guessing what you imagine you know about the story suggests what? When you think of the Tower of Babel story, or if you were to bring this down into a sentence, so take the whole story, these verses we're looking at, what would you suggest the story is about? What ideas do you bring with you about what this generation was attempting to do? Or why does this story, what does it come to teach? We can skip the first person, go right to the second, if sometimes that's more comfortable to not speak first. It's hard. Pride. Okay? What else? Yes, Charles? Teamwork. Okay? Keeping together. Keeping together until such time as, right? God decides not to. Is it a goal? This is sort of the universal quality of the story. Is it a goal that people should be like-minded? Or is it a goal to learn from everybody, and we want differences of opinion, and we're not interested in mandating conformity? Or sometimes we need to all be on the same page, or we need to all come to an agreement. Or this is the tension, I think, that's being explored in this story. What does it resonate for you? Is it prideful to build something that will outlast you? Is it a worthy goal to all be speaking or thinking in the same way? And when does that not work? Or when is that not a goal or a virtue?
Working together for a common goal is everybody's.
Everyone wishes to work together in pursuit of a common goal. That's something to strive for. Yes? Okay? But it's not necessarily a good thing to put it on others. That is to say, what our beliefs are, or to mandate conformity. Okay? I mentioned Jonathan, I'll give you another one. We were talking this morning, Jonathan and I, about, I volunteered that the rabbis asked, what was the sin of Sodom such that Sodom and Gomorrah are completely wiped out? What was the sin of Noah's generation such that the entire world is, again, wiped out? And one of the answers to what was the sin of Sodom was so great was that they had, and this obviously influenced by Greek culture, this rabbinic interpretation, is that the Sodomites practiced mandating conformity by using what's called a Procrustean bed. Anyone know the story of Procrustes and the Procrustean bed? What's a Procrustean bed? Yes? Or it would stretch you. Right? The Procrustean bed was a torture device such that everyone was going to be of the same measure. Or we're going to force you to all either have your body elongated, or we're going to truncate parts of your body, either by amputation, or we're going to force your feet into these small shoes so that everyone is the same size. That's the story of Procrustes, the Procrustes bed, and it's understood in the rabbinic tradition to be a sin of the highest order, to force belief or to compel people to toe this line or all be single-minded. Even as we want to pull together and unify to accomplish certain things, there's a limit to the tension between how much we're going to compel, how much is going to be required of you to conform to whatever it is that the agenda of the day is, or whatever it is that the powers that be are going to mandate. We are likely, I'm projecting onto you, but I know John and I have had conversations about it, that we live at a time right now where there's a lot of that.
Why is it such a sin? Haven't we all stretched the point a little bit to fit into?
Why is what such a sin?
Haven't we all at one time stretched the point to fit a certain situation, or just told maybe not truth, just to make it fit, but you're just stretching the point a little bit? I mean, why is it such a sin to do that?
The question is, why is it such a sin for people to, I don't know, I want to compromise or to...
Make something fit out of necessity.
Why is it a sin to make something fit out of necessity? To trim our sails here, or to pull a punch there, right? Or to manage your impulses to share an idea as soon as it comes into your mind, as if everyone now is entitled to your opinion because you've come up with your opinion, right? Why is that so? I think it's intention. Sometimes we want everyone to agree. And we also look at elections in other countries where 99% of the voters all voted for one candidate. We're a little bit suspicious of that. Elections don't usually get decided by 98 points.
Oh, about when you ran unopposed.
Yeah. I mentioned to Jonathan when I was in rabbinical school, I was elected president of the student body, but I ran unopposed. And so I think I got close to 99% of the vote. The other option was not him, right?
Right.
Yeah. You want to jump in?
Sure. I'm going to come from a very different angle, just for fun, to remember where, for those of us who are not rabbinic scholars, where this story falls in the biblical set of stories. You get one version of creation, a second version of creation, Adam and Eve in the garden, things fall apart, the world goes awry. You get Cain and Abel, one murdering his brother. Then you get Noah and the flood, so God starts over and the flood washes away everything. That's multiple chapters, by the way. Then a genealogy where you get all these descendants, and then you get to this story. And this is the last story before it's a hinge, in effect, before it goes from cosmic history, all the people in the world, starting with Adam and Eve, and then Noah, the do-over, and then it becomes what? The rest of the book of Genesis after this. It's a few families, or one family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that family, what become the Jewish people, that how God is in covenant with them, but this is all background material. So think of this Tower of Babel, or specifically, to be more precise, you have a city and a tower in the midst of it. And what just happened in this biblical narrative? A flood wiped out everything. Complete chaos emerges or comes and covers and destroys all of creation. So what is the response of people to complete chaos? It is often the case it's in the Episcopal Church, I'm sure it's everywhere. You get a bishop who is really, really good administrator, but a terrible people person. And then the next guy or gal is a great people person and a terrible administrator. It happens with college presidents, and it happens with rectors, and it happens all over the place. And or dating somebody, you go back and forth to these extremes as a response to what just happened. So as a response to what just happened, a chaotic flood, a deluge destroys everything. What do the people do as soon as they're able? They build, they create hyper order. Everything has to be the same. We will all speak the same language. We will all live in this one city. You don't go, it's suggested, implied in there, You don't go too far outside of the city. In fact, we're going to build you a tower, so if you get lost, you just look and you stay within that orbit where everybody thinks alike, speaks the same language, has the same opinions on things. It is safety. Why, I would suggest, and I don't think there's one answer at all, why would the people build a tower in the midst of that city? Is it simply a geolocation device like when I moved to Pittsburgh, because you can't find your way around like a grid like many places? I looked for, okay, there's the Cathedral of Learning, there's Calvary, there's East Liberty. When I was walking, I could navigate my way back home, and then larger landmarks. Besides that, why would the people in this, if we're assuming this idea to be true for the sake of argument, this hyper order, why do you build a tower in the midst of this ordered city? Establish identity. And remember something that is not obvious to us, but is absolutely the case in the biblical world. There is earth, that's where we all live. Down there, below earth somewhere, is hell, or the underworld, underneath our world. And up there somewhere is heaven. People knew, they weren't dumb, there are stars and the sun and the moon, but God is somewhere up there. Why does Moses go up the mountain to pray? And there's mythic stories all around the world that you go up to pray, down to death, that type of thing. So you're building a tower. Why would you build a tower in this three-tiered world or universe? Get closer to God. Now, are there other stories of people building a tower in different mythologies, but religions of the world? Lots of them. Why do you build a tower? To get closer to God, to be in communion with God, to go fight, take the fight to God. Well, if there's a flood that covered the earth and you can get hot. I lived in New Orleans, and I'll speak about that in a second. Our house, where Natalie and I lived, was on 3 feet roughly of piers, so about up to here, on brick piers. And when Katrina happened, our house, we'd moved by that time, did not flood. It came right up to the bottom. So that 3 feet made all the difference in livability for months or homelessness for months. And if you can build a really high tower going all the way up to heaven, you don't trust that God promised not ever to bring another flood again with the rainbow. So it's a signal you don't trust God if you're looking at it in just this mythological level. Charles?
The Trump Tower.
The Trump Tower. And what does that mean?
Fraud.
Without being partisan or political, a Trump Tower, Sears Tower, somewhere in Abu Dhabi. Look how awesome we are. We can go higher, bigger, faster. However awesome you think you are, we are that much more awesome. Clever, creative, genius, rich, whatever it may be. Making a name for ourselves. You go in the tower for... You go into protection, you get high enough in case there's another flood. You show off how awesome you are. You go there to get lost. Nancy?
Would they have thought that if they got up to the heavens, they could beat God?
That's a great point. If they get up to heaven, can they beat God? We don't know exactly what's in people's heads, but I think that's a very plausible case to make. If we can, I said, we can take the fight to God, we will replace the divinity because we don't like what he's doing. We don't like, does anybody here like to be judged or told you're wrong or you're not clever or you're sinful or whatever it is? We will just replace God. All of those things we mentioned might be in this idea to build a tower. Allison?
What about getting a better view of things? The higher you get, the better view of the...
Going up higher gives you a better view of things. True, but they didn't go up a mountain to get a better view. They created this thing where everybody's supposed to live. Everybody's forced to have the same language. It's socially engineered that this is it's utopia. that they're creating. My favorite class in college, I think I was a junior, I'd taken a lot of philosophy and religion classes. We spent the whole semester reading books on utopias, no places, by the way, what that means, and dystopias. And it's very often the case when you try to create the perfect society where everybody's equal and we're all going to have the same output. Let's just say Soviet Russia is one example of that, or communist China, or pick a million other places where we have decided what the perfect thing is for everybody, the way to live, and we're going to enforce that on you. This utopia could have a good outcome, could have a bad outcome. They tend not to last, but this is what they're creating, this perfect no place on the plain. By the way, where is this? There's not probably a literal tower that exists on the foundations, but where does the story take place according to the story? Where in the ancient world? Shinar, Babylon, modern-day Iraq. So it's the cradle of civilization, a desert area, and then here, Tigris, Euphrates. By the way, this goes all the way up to the eastern mountains of Turkey. It's this really lush area. So this is kind of like a New Eden with a city in the middle of it, and we're creating the tower in the midst of this new area, and that's what we are doing. It also might suggest we don't need God, or we're going to fight God, and all these different things are just in there. And let me ask, did you want to jump in?
I will.
Who is, because I have to say, I don't like it. Who or what is the God portrayed in the story? A loving, kind, generous father or mother figure?
Not so much.
Not so much. It's a little confusing. Lily asked, why is the God of the Old Testament, is it grouchy?
Grouchy.
Grouchy. I would, maybe not grouchy. How would you describe your mom or dad if they behaved this way? Petty? Unfair? Judgmental? Afraid? Envious? Jealous? They're doing all this stuff. We got to go do something about this. I don't like it. Watch me do something silly. So it's not the God, which, by the way, most of us, I'll say Christians, have a Greek, Latin, Roman view of God. Not the God of the Bible in Christianity is blended with Greek and Roman ideas of omniscient, omnipresent, all-powerful, all the things, God knows everything at once type of stuff. That's not necessarily the God revealed in Hebrew Scriptures, in the Bible. And we put these two things together. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And have this idea of the Christian God, or God even beyond all that. But this story doesn't suggest that at all. God is much more human-like. Is that fair to say? So if God is, by definition, the ultimate, knows what's best, the right, powerful, etc., why would God behave this way? Because he's a petulant teenager who's fearful and jealous and annoyed and wants to show them, my dad can beat up your dad, is basically the argument that this is making. So what is God's response to humans building the city and the tower in the midst of it? I'm going to stop it. How is it stopped? Languages. This is because I love the word perfectly pronounced. In American English, it's bitumen. In English, British, it's bitumen. What is that? Tar, asphalt. It can occur naturally. It can be processed. It's the black gooey stuff like you'd seal a blacktop road. Where else is that used in the Bible? Noah's Ark is sealed with bitumen, the same word. The other mini ark of Moses, on a little wicker basket thrown out on the river to find salvation, that's how they sealed the reeds with bitumen. So that same word keeps popping up of it's a sealing and enclosing, either the Ark of Moses, the Ark of Noah, or in this case, to build this thing, this tower up to there. That means nothing other than I find it fascinating because I like knowing that type of stuff. So God confounds their language. This is where we definitely need the rabbi. The word, so they will not understand one another. The word in Hebrew is, Rabbi?
Shema.
Shema. You ever heard the word, the Shema before? What is the Shema? Go ahead.
So the Shema is the name we give to the piece of liturgy that actually is sort of ripped from the headlines in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, H-E-A-R, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one. Right? That idea. And this notion of Shema, of listening, has also the quality of understanding, or coming to gain an appreciation for. Mark my words. Hark. Right? It's calling your attention to this piece of information. The idea being that we're all on the same page, or we all have a common understanding. In this story, it's suggested that uniformity of belief, which is somewhat different, right, than having a shared understanding, a uniformity of belief is not the goal. Consensus or 100% agreement is not the way in which, according to this story, God intends the world to be. And so God comes down after seeing this activity, not unlike having seen what Adam and Eve are doing in the garden, and does this. It hurts me more than it hurts you, says the parent who's disciplining the child. Says God, essentially, I know you think you're doing the right thing, you're working really well together, but
you're an idiot, Dad. You don't understand me. You're stupid.
Is how we're reading this story with regard to what's taken place. Allison mentioned about towers. I was thinking of ivory towers. We don't think of ivory towers as a good place to be. We tend to describe those who live in the ivory tower as being somehow disassociated from, or not dealing with the pragmatic realities of day-to-day life, because you have the luxury of being in your ivory tower and thinking about ideas or pontificating or suggesting from think tanks what the policy you should run for the campaign on, that idea. The uniformity of belief is not the goal. If you look at this page, which is sort of a nice distillation of a number of different rabbinic interpretations trying to understand what were the people trying to accomplish. What was it about the Tower of Babel that so infuriated, if you will, God, such that everyone's now going to be scattered, or you're going to have to work that much harder to understand each other? Because you have not only different experiences in different places, but you have different language, different cultures, different ideas.
Shema could also be translated as listen. The people can't listen to one another. Does that change the meaning at all? Instead of just understand, they can't listen to each other anymore. Thankfully, in our culture today, everybody listens to everybody else. We don't live in echo chambers at all. Right? Okay, sorry.
No, that's good. It's good. So if you just take a glance, and we won't read it all the way through, but the kinds of ideas the rabbis in the Talmudic period, and then in the last, go back to the 17th century or so, 500 years or so ago, were working with this same story. What was the goal? What is the objective in getting people to agree to a common understanding? Why is that a goal, and why is that sometimes an obstacle? That's what this story is coming to invite us to consider. And what's the sin? What's the problem if everyone understands it together? Why is that not a laudable goal? Please.
I think you're blessed with your own
Free will.
And I think the encouragement would be that you're mindful and you're open-minded, and you're only going to evolve and learn the more that you listen to other people.
So we need the diversity of experience and opinions in order to grow in understanding. Okay? Yes, Tom?
I guess I would say that if everybody believed the same way, you said uniformity. Well, people could believe
Correct.
They all have different. So I think the concern is, do we really want everybody to believe the same way? And so I think what the story says is God was awesome from that, which is that people speak the same language.
Right. So the goal, Tom says, in that is the goal mandating uniformity of belief? Because when that takes place, you can accomplish really wonderful things if we all agree that this is the direction in which we're going to go because we have this shared understanding or belief. But in that kind of closed system, it's easy to be going off in the wrong direction, as if I'm some omniscient observer, because we convince ourselves that this is, in fact, the way to go. Right? Is that essentially what you're inviting us to appreciate? Yeah. If we all think the same way, how do we know we're doing the right thing? Right? Remember, please. Susan.
I've spent my life teaching 4 languages.
4 languages.
So to me, the story is always about the actual issue of languages.
Okay?
And my life has been enriched by being in different places and communicating in other languages. I've always seen it as a good thing. But I'm confused about whether the story says that it was some kind of punishment or something bad that different languages were created, or is it saying that it was a good thing? And from what you said, I'm still
Okay. So Susan suggests that she's been
Elise.
teaching languages for 4 decades. And there's a lot to be learned and gained, and we have a wider understanding for the benefit of these different languages. And yet in the story, it's described as a punishment to now be dispersed and have different languages or cultures, right? And why is that considered a punishment? Is that the question? Thoughts? Why is it considered a punishment that we shouldn't be able to understand each other immediately?
I think that's a great point. They didn't have Google Translate back then.
No.
You met a guy and he was speaking some language. If you didn't understand him, it wasn't an issue of, oh, let's be friendly with this guy. He didn't know what he was saying.
Right.
Right. So it was people, this story is people trying to understand, why the heck did God make this person who I can't understand?
Yes. So the story is often understood as ideological.
Etiological. Why it's a why or pourquoi story explains the cause for something. Why do tigers have stripes? Why does a snake crawl on the ground? So there's a story to explain that. Nowadays, we use, well, because it evolved and so on and so forth. This is why there are diversity of languages. At one level, the story functions in that way. Everybody speaks a different language because at one time we all, which makes some intuitive sense, everybody lived in one place and spoke the same language. And as we spread apart, we begin to speak different languages as we were in different communities that way. So at a very base level, it's an ideological why story. You going to say
Yes,
more?
no, go ahead.
Let me address, there's not one answer for what Elise asked at all, but in line with that, why would God do such a thing, presuming that God knows better? So what is the covenant God makes with people? Beginning at the beginning, this is, remember, Genesis, that book, with Adam and Eve in the garden, and Noah and all afterwards. What is the covenant God makes? I will be your God. You are to go out into the world, to be spread across the earth, to be fruitful and to multiply, and to dominate the earth and strip it of all its resources. No, to tend the garden, to be stewards of it, to look after the garden and one another. You, this is my words, are to be my ambassadors out in the world. You are to share and live and enact this covenant in the rest of creation. Here's how you do that. With other people, with animals, with the rest of the natural environment. That's what you're supposed to do. And so I'm going to hold up my end of the bargain. And then you guys didn't. So let's wipe it all out with Noah and the ark. Okay, I'm not going to do that again. I promise. Rainbow, see, no, pinky promise. Definitely not happening. But my covenant hasn't gone away. Covenant is a foundational concept in the Bible. It is fundamentally different, well, radically different than when we think of a contract. Because if you sign your name, it's almost like magic in our culture. Except, is this right, attorney? Yeah, you put your name to it, it has the enforcement of law. But do couples ever get divorced? Yeah, roughly half the time. Does somebody ever stretch the truth a little, Allison? Not you. You would never do that. Or would call that a white lie, or take-backs, or you don't uphold your end of the contract. That happens all the time in relationships between individuals and groups. That's, in fact, the human way of doing things. Covenant by God is unbreakable except by God. And if God promises, that's the idea, I won't ever destroy the whole earth again with a flood or anything else, okay, we can assume that to be true. And this relationship, I will be your God and you will be my people, there's no take-backs. This is what the relationship is supposed to be like forever. Adam and Eve, they mess it up. Okay, fine. Who told you you're naked is the first response to that. Get out of the garden. You're going to have to work for a living. This is why snakes crawl. You're going to have trouble in childbirth. Life is going to be hard. Another ideological story. Why is life hard? Because we messed up. Why is there a flood in this Noah story? Because humans were bad. There are lots of flood or great deluge stories from all over the world, and there are two reasons why God brings a flood in whatever culture. People were bad, or entropy, things fall apart. Except the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is my favorite one. Why does God bring a flood to wipe out the whole world? Because God looked down and the people were noisy. That is fantastic. You're being noisy, wiped out from now on. People were bad, there's entropy. Get rid of it all, and so God again starts over. The covenant endures all throughout the Scripture. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, brothers kill brothers. This is still the deal, still the covenant. Wipe out the whole creation with the flood. Noah, same covenant endures. And the first thing the people do is, well, we don't trust you, God. So as soon as we get enough of us, we start building a city and building a tower that says we don't trust you. We're going to get high enough to escape another flood. I don't trust you. Trust but verify. We don't believe that you're going to do this or do that, so we will show off and trust in ourselves. And that same idea, we as humans are breaking the covenant. And so God, does he kill everybody again? No. So you're not listening to one another. You're not listening to me. This is again the parental figure. This is my interpretation of all this. What am I going to do to get you to learn what this darn covenant is? And so there is stern language from God. Well, you hate me. You don't love me. You don't understand me. I always think of us as teenagers in the story, the human part. And God says, fine. If you won't do your homework and your handwriting is bad, you're going to have to rewrite your notebook with all your homework every single time. Did that happen to you? And she has brilliant handwriting and that had straight A's because you must do it right over and over until you get it. Now, that was really annoying at the time, but when you get older, that was actually a really good idea because we learned what you're supposed to do. And so if God confounds the language, if you don't trust me, I'm going to show you another way rather than killing you, rather than making you live in the basement forever. You're going to have to be dispersed and go all over the world and have all these languages so you can begin to learn to listen to one another and trust me to fulfill the covenant. You can't do it yourselves. You got to do it this way. There's one interpretation. Let me contrast before Aaron comes back in a really interesting related language story, Elise and Stephanie. In the book of Acts, we read on Pentecost. Here's the story about language, and pair these. On the day of Pentecost, what's Pentecost in Jewish tradition?
Shavuot.
Shavuot, it's a harvest festival where the Jews gather. the Pentecost to come, all were together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, kind of like crazy chaos. And it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as a fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. And all of them were filled with the presence of God and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were Jews, devout Jews from every nation under heaven, the ones that had been spread out over all the earth, not just on the plain of Shinar, all the earth, and they were all in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the great voice from heaven, this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one of them heard them speaking, understood, listened, Shema, in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these speaking Galileans," which is like country folks from the Mon Valley? "And how is it that we hear, each of us in our own native language?" And then it lists a whole bunch of them. "In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All were amazed and perplexed, not understanding, not listening, not hearing, saying to one another, 'What does this mean?'" So in the Christian narrative, this is the follow-up, the coda, the resolution, really, to that earlier story. So we're dispersed in language, and then wherever you are, you hear about God's power again in a way that you can understand. I just think that's fascinating. Any questions, thoughts, or Aaron? Steve?
So it wasn't a punishment then. It was a rebuke with a path toward redemption.
It wasn't a punishment then. It was a rebuke or a path to redemption. That is how I interpret the story, yes. Again, I don't want to, you must believe like I do. That would be the same Tower of Babel problem. But keep it wild, and that's a way of, gosh, now as a 5-year-old, your parents are the most wonderful piece of all of creation. And you get to be 12 to 13, and they're idiots, and they're 18. As long as they pay for stuff, they're not bad. And then in your 30s, they get much wiser. My God, by the time you're 50, they really knew what they were talking about, and you cut them a break. That's that interpretation. Maybe God was helping them in a way they did not understand at the time. Who else? You had your hand up?
I was just thinking, I know everybody else has probably thought of this. This could be, we could put a modern interpretation on this. Maybe God's mad at us because that's why he's sending off this climate change, and then he's telling us something. It seems to fit.
So is God mad at us that brings this punishment or this reaction like climate change? Maybe. You could also say, and I'll speak from my experience in New Orleans, why did the flood of Hurricane Katrina happen in 2005? Because there was a once every 100-year flood and it was awful. Or you could say, well, they had years and years of funding in the Army Corps of Engineers, and the money somehow got diverted to other stuff, and whatever, and it's the most corrupt city in the country, and we still loved it, but it's really dangerous and tragic in how beautiful and just poor and destitute it is at the same time. And maybe the money was spoiled, and maybe they could have prepared like Holland does with less money. And is it our fault? Things fall apart? Or is it God's punishment? Or could be both, depending on how you look at it? I think that's plausible. Dave?
The whole story here confuses me. Isn't this creatures trying to make God human?
Isn't it creatures trying to make God human?
Yeah, he's on the no matter what they did, they could never become anything close to God.
No matter what they did, they could never become close to God. Fair, very sound theological, reasonable point. We can never be like God or take God's place. Has that ever stopped us from trying, would be my counterpoint. In a gazillion ways, I know better than mom and dad. I know better than God. That's human. Now, is that free will? There has to be allowance for free will, or we're just robots, puppets. But we've never stopped trying. But again, I'll say God is always faithful to the covenant. We're not, but that doesn't mean God gets rid of the deal. Why would God punish us? For which part? Why would God punish us for trying to build a tower, or I would say more broadly, not keeping the covenant, which is, I've said it several times, caring for all the creation and one another, tending the garden, letting God be God. I'll say if you know the stories, I'm much more a Martha than a Mary, like I'm a doer rather than a beer in those stories. I know better than God most of the time. And if I work hard enough and strong enough, maybe I will convince God that my way is the best way. How to be a rector, how to be a husband, how to be a human being, whatever the case may be. And I'm really, really trying, but I know that is an absolute tendency of mine. If I work hard enough, I can solve all the problems, rather than work as hard as I can, but let it go to let God be God, and be faithful and trust, that's the operative word in all this, trust that God will keep the promises that he, she made. That is unbelievably hard for me. I know you love me, but is essentially the story of the Bible repeated constantly.
I'm going to speak to a plumb line that that I recognize running through a number of these questions. When it comes to the idea about free will or about whether we experience what happens to us. In this story, it's clear that God is a protagonist who comes down, looks around, evaluates things, and then makes a ruling, as it were. But I want to contrast that with, if you remember the story of where Moses goes to Pharaoh to demand the release of the Hebrew slaves. Pharaoh denies, and it says in the story that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and then Pharaoh is punished for not allowing with the death of the firstborn and the rest of the plagues. And the classic question in Jewish philosophy and thought is, if God is responsible for hardening Pharaoh's heart, how can God then hold Pharaoh responsible for what Pharaoh did? How much free will is there actually if God is the puppeteer, or if God is the director of the play? All the world's a stage. God's the director, and here we are. And so we experience it perhaps, or we think of it in terms of it being punished, of the people being punished. They had a goal in mind. They were working together on a project, and then God pulls out the rug out from under them, or scatters all the people and frustrates their ability to understand each other. When we think of disciplining someone, that's a different cast than punishing someone, or directing or inspiring someone. Or sometimes we look back. It's really an important part of human resiliency to practice what's called synthesizing happiness. Synthesizing happiness is looking back on an unfortunate event, a turn of fortune, a reversal, a loss, whatever it might be, that you would never have wished for in the moment. You grieved it, it broke your heart, it was really challenging. But then at a later date, you look back and say, well, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have walked through this doorway, I wouldn't have met this individual, my life wouldn't have gone in this direction, and therefore we might say, using the idiom with which we're all familiar, well, it was part of God's plan. Right? And that's called synthesizing happiness, as opposed to forever being stuck with what you're going through during the breakup or the immediate days after a death or a job loss or whatever. And so where we ascribe, where we place God in the drama, whether it's some outside of us coming down and evaluating and then meting out a punishment, or whether we're inspired in a particular way, or whether we can say that God moves in mysterious ways and we take our own initiative in doing that. And so perhaps the idea of building this city and building this tower for whatever purpose, whether it's to challenge God or to best God or to find a safe way out of the next flood, isn't so much a punishment frustrating that, but now needs to be that which takes place. Yeah?
Yeah, from what you say, I'm just thinking that sometimes whether something is a punishment or a curse or a blessing depends very much on our attitude or what we're trying to do and what we want. So it is not actually good for us to set ourselves up as God or not gods. And if that's what we want to have a one unified society all trying to be God, which would probably also mean some people are checking the power over other people, then being split into many different languages would feel like a curse. It's
Right.
really impossible for us to do that. But in my essence, I love languages. But to
repeat that if you could.
So essentially, the comment is that whether we perceive something as a punishment or whether it's understood to be a benefit, it may be frustrating for you, it may require new learning, it may be a series of challenges, but if it's actually for the best, I'm thinking of Shakespeare's phrase, there's neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Right? It's whose ox is being gored, one man's trash is another man's treasure, whether we see it as punishment or whether we see it as a realignment or the guidance that we would hope someone with more information or a greater concern or a wider aperture might provide for us. Yes?
As you're saying, I'm just thinking, we use disruption in education all the time, right? You have someone who perhaps thinks they've got it all, and you need to disrupt that a little bit in order to bring it to another level, so it could be looked at that way.
And how do we, so the comment is that there's often disruption involved in education. You have these ideas, and then we're going to give you something else to think about, right? Or we're going to challenge the assumptions you've made. And that's a good thing, right? We need that other perspective, yeah.
Another analogy that I've been thinking of is baby-proofing your house.
Uh-huh.
If you can see that, my toddler might fall down the stairs, so I'm going to put up a baby gate.
Right.
You're not punishing the child. You're just seeing that there's this dangerous path, and you don't want them to take the path. So you're creating a barrier, but it's not like either to reward them or punish them. It's just for their safety.
That's very nice. Everyone catch that? Sort of like baby-proofing your house. You're limiting access to the staircase, or you're plugging the electrical outlets or whatever it is in order to create a safe space as opposed to trying to restrict freedom. Yes?
Supposedly Edison said, I did not fail. I found 1,000 ways that did not work.
Right?
Maybe that's what we're going through. Hey, that didn't work. Let's not do that again.
Very good.
Thank you all very much today.
Good.